Thank you, Mark. So good afternoon. So as Mark mentioned, so I'm a clinician scientist working in drug addiction. But today I will not talk about drug addiction, so it's a little bit off topic for me. Okay, so I will start with my disclosure. So my work is primarily funded by CIHR and NIH. I got multiple other support over the years. Some relevant support for this work is that I have done some work with a product from JW Pharma called Sativex in relation to cannabis use disorder. And also doing some research on impact of cannabis on the driving with Dr. Mann, Bruna Brands. And so we got some products from a licensed producer. And we are also planning some study on social anxiety with some products as well from a licensed producer. But I have no other conflict to declare. Okay, so this is the outline of the presentation. So I will be briefly covering the opioid crisis and then talking about how maybe the neurobiology could help here. And I will mostly focus my presentation on a review of the literature we have recently published and some recent updates in that time. So as you may have heard, we have currently opioids that are widely used, and those opioids have some certainly medical utility for severe pain control, but also lead to lots of problems due primarily to their addictive potential, the economic cost that is induced by the misuse of those opioids, and lots of medical complications that can be induced by opioids. And opioids, you know, if you push the dose, it will produce an impact on the systems that control respiration. So the subject will lose the need to breathe, which led usually to cardiac arrest and death, and they are dead from overdose. There is also the risk from injecting opioids that lead to HIV, hepatitis, and that's what we see in chronic drug users. So why are we talking about this now? Because as you know, Canada is one of the highest users of opioid in the world. So that's something we share with the United States and also Australia. So those are the three hotspots in the world for the problem related to opioids. So as you know, the situation is getting worse by the day. So there is lots of reports that you can look, but there have been in Ontario in the past 5 years an increase of ED visits related to opioid poisoning, and that can be related to heroin, but also synthetic opioids. So I will not go too much into the numbers today, but some number that I would like you to keep in mind is that if we are looking at the number of people dying from opioid overdose, so last year, the highest spot was in British Columbia, and we are reaching 1,400 deaths in a year there. And currently in Ontario, we have 800 people that died last year, which means currently we have 2 people dying per day in Ontario from opioid overdose. And the situation is just getting worse and worse. So why do we have all those problems? Is that, and I will go very quick on this, it's a vast problem, but if you look at the evolution over the year of the number of prescription and the opioid load that we have in the population, there is a very clear parallel between the quantity of opioids that are distributed in the population and the negative consequences. So those negative consequences covering death, number of overdose, number of people getting into addiction related to opioids. So you have maybe heard about the idea that potentially the cannabinoid system could be a useful target to fight the opioid crisis. And I will start by a clinical case. So this has been covered by several presentators before me. So here I would like to highlight a case of a young woman that came to one of the specialized service we have at CAMH. It's part of the addiction medicine service, and it's called the Interprofessional Addiction and Pain and Addiction Recovery Clinic. So it's a pain and addiction clinic, to put it briefly, that is led by Andrew Smith. And it's receiving patients that have chronic pain problem, but that over time they have been exposed to opioid drugs, and they lose control on their opioid medications. They get into problem, and they end up having an opioid addiction problem and a chronic pain problem, and those are typically complicated patients to treat. So this clinic is specializing into treatment of those patients. So this is a case of a woman, 24 years old, that had sickle cell anemia, and she was referred to the clinic because of chronic hip problem, lower back pain, moderate to severe intensity, and you can see it was burning, itching, radiating into groin, exacerbated by weight bearing, alleviated by rest. So she was using hydromorphone to treat the pain, and she was using around the clock. And the hydromorphone was just alleviating for a short moment of time, and she had very high pain severity using the BPI scale. So the dose of hydromorphone she ended up taking was 72 milligram daily, corresponding to 360 milligram morphine equivalent day. So ultra high dose of opioid. So in addition to that, she was going in crisis on a regular basis, leading to emergency visit at least once a month. She was seeking IV hydromorphone to relieve pain there. She was on different other medication. The examination led to clear pain in the hip area, and she had MRI indicating avascular necrosis. So there was clearly an underlying good reason for the pain. And she was diagnosed with chronic pain, potentially opioid-induced hyperalgesia, opioid tolerance, and end-of-dose failure. So the way this has been managed as a clinic was initially to rotate from this short-acting opiate to a long-acting opiate. And so this rotation was made to Cadian, and she was stabilized on this with 200 milligram. And with this shift from short-acting to long-acting, there was a clear improvement of the functioning. So slept better, lowering of the score on the pain scale, and so clear improvement. And over time, other medications were put in place, but still there was pain that significantly impacted her functioning. So, and one day she came to the clinic and she reported using cannabis, and that was helpful for her to sleep better and potentially reducing the pain. So that led the clinician in the clinic to start Nabilon. And Nabilon was gradually introduced and titrated up. And with the introduction of Nabilon, there was also a taper of Cadian that was able to happen, and the dose was reduced to 80 milligram daily. And so currently she's still using that, but also use cannabis primarily on the evening, and her functioning has been improving, and she is planning to go back to, she went back to college, and she's planning to continue to decrease the dose of opioid. So this is a case, I think we have seen multiple cases like that. And this illustrates that you can have in those type of situations maybe two things going on at the same time. Maybe an utility of cannabinoid drugs, will it be pharmaceutical or smoked cannabis to control pain, but also potentially to reduce the dose of opioid. And so this is what is called opioid sparing. So how could a cannabinoid drug produce an opioid sparing effect? So this is a slide here of a rat brain that is representing the distribution of the opioid receptor in the brain. So this analogy has been made before between cannabinoid and an opioid receptor. So the situation with opioid receptor, you have different type of opioid receptors, the mu, delta, kappa receptor. So primarily when we talk about addiction and pain, it's the mu opioid that is the relevant opioid receptor. But you have also the CB1 receptor, and you have seen that slide before of the distribution of the protein. So what is interesting is when you try to overlap the two. So, and this is what is shown in this slide here. You have multiple brain areas that have an overlap of the CB1 and the mu opioid receptor. So how can those interactions happen? So you have multiple mechanisms that are feasible, and I've read some of those literature. So you have hundreds, if not thousands, of paper to read here. So I will not cover it all. This is very much a broad overview of this. So you have multiple ways the two systems can interact. So you have cannabinoid drugs that themselves can produce a release of opioid peptide in the brain. But you have also the opposite. Opioid drug can produce an endocannabinoid release. There is also very clear evidence now that direct receptor-receptor interaction can happen when you co-express those receptors in the same cells. You have on the signaling pathway of those receptor interactions that can happen, so that's at the intracellular level. There are some regulation, cross-regulation of receptor density. Also, the effect there is not great. So that means if you expose an animal to THC, then you measure the impact on the opioid receptor expression and vice versa. So you see some effect, but I would say mostly modest effect. Where you see a much stronger effect is cross-tolerance and sensitization. So this means that if you expose an animal to opiate, they will develop a tolerance to opiate, but also at the same time to cannabinoid drugs, even they have never been exposed to cannabinoid drugs. And you can see the same in the other direction. If you treat, and that is usually, the tolerance is usually seen when you treat continuously. On the opposite end, if you treat the animal intermittently, you produce what is called sensitization. So they can become more responsive to the drug, and you can see those cross-sensitizations. So you treat an animal intermittently with opiates, they will respond more to cannabinoid drugs. And you have some mutual potentiation, and that has been shown clearly for the analgesic effect. So you will not see necessarily much on this, but this is an illustration here on the left of how the endocannabinoid system is involved on the signaling that is triggered by morphine at the intracellular level. On the right, you can see the analgesic effect. And this is done in mice here. But what is clear is that if you treat the animal with morphine, so you produce an analgesic effect, and this analgesic effect is blocked by an opioid antagonist like naloxone. But if you treat the animal with a cannabinoid antagonist, you will also block some of this analgesic effect. So I find this is quite interesting. And this is obtained by a CB1 blocker, not by CB2. So this is also an interesting study. It was done also in animals. And here what they have done is injected different doses of THC. And what they found is as you push the dose of THC up, you can produce analgesia. What they have found also is the same with morphine. So the more morphine the animal was getting, the more analgesic effect. And then they study the two together. And they have developed what is called an isobologram. So you can see like what happened when you co-administer THC and morphine together. And so this is the line that is represented on the oblique line on the right. this would be the effect you get if there is no synergy. But experimentally, they got the experimental point on the bottom left of the they got this experimental point which indicates that there has been synergic effect. So there is more effect than if you were just combining the two together. So I think this supports potentially the opioid sparing effect of cannabinoids. So we were quite intrigued by this 3 years ago. And so we started with a group of investigators, some investigators from Canada and some investigators from Australia, and Mark Ware also was involved. And we decided to review the literature concerning this and looking both at animal model and also clinical trials. So the search we ran went up to end of 2015. So this is the paper was published last year in Neuropsychopharmacology. So if some of you want to read it, I'm happy to send the copy to you. So this is mostly what the number of articles we identify. So there was like initially more than 3,000 leads, and then we narrowed down to a more restricted number. So there was clearly more study on the preclinical side and a much limited set of study on the clinical side. So we were able for the preclinical study to perform a meta-analysis. And so here you can see what happened in terms of opioid reduction when you compare like morphine alone or morphine administered with THC. So there was a study looking at that, and we were able to put 6 studies together. And mostly the conclusion was that there was a stronger effect when combining the two, morphine and THC. And the ED50 was 3 times lower. The dose of morphine that you need to give was 3 times lower, mostly. We also identified some study looking at codeine associated with THC, and only 2 studies could be put together in the meta-analysis here, but still favoring the combination for an opioid-sparing effect. And the effect was even stronger here with a dose, I think, around 9 times lower, so ED50 with the combination as compared codeine alone. So mostly the conclusion of the meta-analysis is there is strong preclinical support for the opioid-sparing effect of cannabinoid drugs. So we also looked at the clinical studies that were available at that time. So I will not go into the detail, but we prepared in the paper summary table. So if you have an interest in this, it's in a quick read. You can see like what population, what intervention, and what effect. So that's you can find that easily on the slide. I will jump directly to the conclusion. So the conclusion was that most of this evidence was of low quality. So we found 1 paper that was rated very low quality, 3 low quality evidence, 2 moderate quality, and we had 3 RCT of high quality. So looking at the result, like none of the high quality study provided evidence of an opioid-sparing effect. So, and we have evidence of an opioid-sparing effect at that time in only 1 very low-quality study. So mostly the situation was quite interesting at that time. So we were thinking there is something very clear happening in animals, in humans, despite like lots of anecdote, not so clear data were coming up. And as a reminder, this was 2 years ago. So now there have been few things coming up since that time. So 1 paper that came out a few months ago from the group of Margaret Haney at Columbia, and this is on the impact of co-administration of oxycodone and smoked cannabis on analgesia and abuse liability. So you can, and she used here a cold pressure test. So if you put your hand into a very cold water, then after a certain period of time, this is becoming so painful that you perceive the pain, And then if you hold the hand in the water a little bit longer, at some point you cannot stand it. You have to remove your hand from there. So what she found is that if you associate smoked cannabis low dose with oxycodone low dose, there is a potentiation of the analgesia there. The threshold, or the time that it takes to feel the pain, and also the time to remove the hand from the cold water, like those effects are clearly potentiated with the co-administration of low-dose oxy plus smoked cannabis. So this is a potential indication also for utility of cannabis there. So there have been also few publications looking at the use of opioid in people receiving cannabis for medical purposes. So one was a cross-sectional survey of patients with chronic pain. And in that paper, what they reported that there was a 64% reduction in opioid dose. And that the patient decreased number and side effects of medication, improved quality of life. Another publication reported 44% of reduction in opioid dose in chronic pain patients and decreased pain ratings. So I think this is quite strong effects. And when you look at those publications, you think, yeah, that's probably something real. But keep in mind, those are cross-sectional type of observation. There is no control. So we are not sure that this is due to cannabis. It could just be pure placebo effect. So another publication you have maybe heard about is a study that was reported end of last year. And this was concerning the situation related to opioid-related deaths in Colorado. So what the researcher did here is they looked at a time series design to compare the change in level and slope of monthly opioid-related deaths before and after Colorado store began selling recreational cannabis. So this is the result of their paper. So what you see is the number of deaths reported, and you can see this is growing up over the year. And you have in 2014 the vertical line here. This is the time where cannabis become available there. So you can see there have been this trend of opioid deaths going up and up and up. And it seems that at this time point something happened, because it stopped going up, it went down a little bit. Is that directly linked to cannabis becoming available in the state? I cannot say for sure. Maybe something else happened. But I find this quite intriguing. Maybe some of you have heard 2 days ago in CBC there was an article saying, hey, something is going on very interesting in the US, in the states that have medical cannabis or cannabis available. So I looked at the paper yesterday, so I will not be able to comment much because it's 2 papers that came out in the same issue. It just has been published a few days ago, so I just had a quick look at those. But in the first paper, what they looked at are what is going on in the US states that had medical cannabis law implemented, and then what happened with the number of opioid prescribing in what they call Medicare Part D population. So that's people that are on Medicare, but they can take an optional program reimbursing for some more medication. So what they report is that on average in those states, you had 23 million daily doses of any opioid dispensed per year in the average state. But when there was medical cannabis law put in place, there was less daily opioid dose prescribed. So the state with active dispensary, they saw 3.7 million fewer daily doses filled. And state with home cultivation, so 1.7 million fewer filled daily doses. So those are large number when you think of it. And this is per state. So if you multiply to the whole US, it's millions and millions less opioid dose. And what is interesting here is like home cultivation seems to have less of an effect compared active dispensaries. So in the same issue, another article, and here what they looked at is impact on opioid prescribing for Medicaid enrollees. So, and what they conclude in this paper is that state implementation of medical marijuana law associated with 5.8 lower rate of opioid prescribing. And if you have also recreational use that become added to states that had already medical cannabis available, you see even a greater reduction of the rate of opioid prescribing. So this is quite interesting, I find, because those are not like anecdotal data. Those are based on the whole prescription of the whole population of United States. So looking at like millions and millions of individuals. So the conclusion, what we can say at this point is that THC, clearly if you look at what's going on in animal model, you have clear analgesia that can be produced by THC, and you can also potentiate the effect of opioid drugs. So the preclinical evidence supports the opioid-sparing effect of cannabinoid drugs. But at this point, in human subject, there is limited evidence to support this. But we have at this point large-scale epidemiological studies suggesting that some potential of cannabinoid availability to reduce the opioid load in population and potentially also reduce the consequences such as mortality. Also for that, we have less evidence. So at this point of time, I would say we need direct clinical trial, directly testing for an opioid-sparing effect of cannabinoid drugs. Like those trials have not been yet conducted properly in my view. So I think at this point of time, for those of you that prescribe in this area, I think we have to be very cautious because the evidence is not so clear yet. So we have to be informing our patients that this is not a validated approach. We have to go slow, prescribe cannabinoid for a short period of time. And I think those type of principles like are in agreement with CPSO or CCFP guidelines. Like we have to be cautious and inform the patient of what we are doing, and that will reduce the risk. So I would like to acknowledge the work done by Andrew Smith that contributed to some of the patient charts. And yeah, I should have said also I mentioned one case, but we looked also at multiple other cases, and we have found in a series of 20 patients, something like that, a very clear also opioid reduction effect. So it was not just one case in the clinic, it happened in many cases. And I would like also to thank the Australian collaborator that were strongly involved in this, and Mark. Thank you all.